Again, my name is Lindsey. I have responsibilities for soybeans and small grains in Ohio. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done this past year with variable rate soybeans and just soybean seeding rates in general. If you guys have any questions as I'm going along, feel free just to interrupt me, ask your questions. I don't have a ton of slides. Harold made me write a corn newsletter article on Monday, and that seemed to absorb a lot of my time, so I had to convince people not to plant soybeans in February. Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. So if anything pops up, please just interrupt me. So this is some data about seeding rate in Ohio. This was collected out of that NCSRP project that Sean Conley talked about earlier. So basically with that study, we can collect information regionally about practices. So here you're looking at average seeding rate. This was for the first 2 years of the study, 2014 and 15. You can see on average in Ohio, in most regions, average seeding rate is 160 to 180,000 seeds per acre. Maybe in north central and northeastern Ohio, a little bit lower. So that's what we're looking at for average seeding rates. To kind of follow that up, we had a seeding rate, row width by seeding rate study, 2 years at 3 locations in Ohio, Wood, Wayne, and Clark County. We looked at 3 row widths, 7.5, 15, and 30 inch, and then 5 seeding rates starting as low as 50,000 seeds per acre all the way up to 250,000 seeds per acre. So row width, Sean, how many of you were here for Sean Conley's talk? Oh, great, so I don't really have to repeat a whole lot. So Sean Conley touched a little bit on row width. With the NCSRP data, he was showing that 15 and 30 inch rows yielded higher and similarly, and narrow rows were lower yielding, the 7.5 inch rows. Our small plot data doesn't really reflect that. We're still kind of combing through that NCSRP data, so I guess that's one, maybe not mistake, I'll clear up from Sean's, but I think there's more to that row width story. Our data in Ohio almost consistently shows 30 inch rows yield less than 7.5s and 15s, and the 7.5 and 15s tend to yield similar. I think some of the issues, maybe not issues, but with the NCSRP data, Ohio is grouped with Indiana and Illinois geographically. And in Ohio, we have very little data on 30 inch rows from that survey. So I think a lot of that 30 inch data is coming from other states. So with our research, small plot research, on average, there's about a 9 bushel per acre yield reduction in 30 inch rows compared to narrow rows. This is a picture of our plots, 3 of our plots at the western location. This is in Clark County. So you're going, I guess, left or right. 30 inch rows, 15 inch rows, and 7.5 inch rows planted at 50,000 seeds per acre. And 50,000 seeds per acre is not something I'm promoting in any way, shape, or form. But when you do research, you get to do a lot of weird things that you guys would never consider doing. 50,000 seeds per acre. The first set of pictures is from June 24th. And if you look at those 3 pictures on the top, the 30 inch row beans look the best. That's definitely the most consistent, uniform stand at that low seeding rate. The 7.5 inch row with 50,000 seeds per acre is very clumpy and gappy because that's about as low as you can do. Yeah. That's a great question. So we did do final stands. I don't remember exactly the number on these plots, but usually when we plant 50,000 seeds per acre, our final stands are pretty darn close to 50,000. Usually they're 40 to 45. At our higher seeding rates, up to 250,000 seeds per acre, our final stands are usually about 50% of what we plant and what we have. So I think soybeans self-thin. So when we have these less plants per acre initially, we get a lot of them to stay in the fall. When we have those really, really high seeding rates, 250,000 seeds per acre in 30 inch rows is a lot. We have about 50% left in the fall. And that trend is very consistent. Any other questions about that? Yeah.
Is that just an acre or full acre?
This is small plot research. Yep, these are small plots, and then we adjust it to be bushels per acre. The second set of pictures on the bottom are about a month later. This is July 31st. The 15 and 7.5 inch rows, for the most part, have filled in. We still have a little bit of a gap there where no plants were planted in the 7.5 inch row width. But what you'll notice here in the 30 inch rows, you can still see some soil. So with those wider rows, we didn't get canopy closure even by July 31st. And this was probably planted about the 3rd or 4th week of May. So looking at yields, these are the yields of these exact plots. Our highest yield was 78 bushels per acre. This was 15 inch rows, 50,000 seeds per acre. Our higher seeding rates did yield more. 50,000 had a reduced yield, but still 78 bushels per acre. When we had 30 inch rows, the yield of this plot was 61 bushels, and in 7.5 inch rows it was 62 bushels. So that 15 inch row width was kind of a sweet spot there at these populations. Any questions about that? So Sean Conley said that he mentioned that 100,000 plants per acre in the fall is really what you should be shooting for. I have mine a little bit more cautious. I have 100,000 to 120,000 plants per acre, I guess, to give a little bit more of a cushion. But when we have this range of plants in the fall at harvest, that's generally where we see maximum yield. And this is for May planting dates. As you plant later and later, you need higher populations. We've had 2 years of double crop soybean research in Clark County, and there we maximize our yield and economic return at 200 to 250,000 seeds per acre. And this is for end of June into July planting. So there is a planting date effect when you're looking at seeding rate. One thing I always want to encourage people to do is to take a stand count in the fall. How many of you take a stand count in the fall? A couple. And that's really great, because I'm always surprised by what you think you plant and what ends up in the fall. There can be some pretty big differences there. To get a final stand of 100,000 depends on a lot of factors. The soil, the weather after planting, I think, was huge in 2017. The planter, the operator, there's a variety of factors that can affect that final stand. So really you should be shooting for 100,000 in the fall, and what you need to drop in the spring is going to depend on your growing conditions and what you know about your field. In our research trials, we usually plant 140 to 150,000 seeds per acre. So moving on to variable rate seeding. After we did our small plot research, the next step was to look at large trials, strip trials on farm, looking at variable seeding rates. Because we noticed in our locations, the optimum seeding rate does vary by year and location. So I think there is something to variable seeding rate. We had 5 locations in 2017, 2 in West Central Ohio, 2 in Central, and 1 in North Central. This field here specifically is North Central. All of our sites were designed fairly similar. The grayscale pattern here is the prescription. So each farmer picked his own prescription, whatever he wanted to do. I think this farmer was looking at organic matter, soil organic matter, to make his zones. And then what we did, we superimposed strips across the field. The blue strips represent a low, medium, and high fixed rate all the way across the field. What low is depends on the farmer. Some people don't let us go as low as others, but on average our low fixed rate is 100,000 seeds per acre. Our medium is 140,000 seeds per acre, and then our high was 180,000 seeds per acre. So then we want to compare these fixed strips in these zones to the variable seeding rates. And all of the sites were similar to this one in design and replication, but each farmer had a different method on how they made their prescription. So the real 3 big questions we want to answer with this research, and I don't have all the answers today because it's a work in progress, but first, how do we make the prescriptions in zones? There's a variety of different ways of doing that. Some farmers use soil maps, soil series, soil properties, yield history. a lot of different methods, a combination of factors. The second thing is, does variable rate seeding pay? It costs money to upgrade equipment or purchase new equipment with this technology. Does it pay? And then 3, what seeding rate should be used for each zone? And we can look at that retrospectively at the end of the season. Interestingly enough, I wrote a grant to get this funded, 2 grants. One got funded, which was great. The second grant did not get funded because we know all of these answers. Anyone know all of these answers? Yeah. So I thought it should get funded because no one knows these answers, but apparently everybody knows these answers. So my disclaimer, this research is a work in progress. We have 1 year of field trials complete. We are repeating it in 2018. And the individual sites, we're still working through the data. So I'm going to present data from just a couple of our sites, not all of them. So how to make a prescription. Again, some farmers use yield history. I think that can be really valuable. The farmers we're working with, some of them have that data, some of them don't because they're new at it. There has been some research looking at yield history, and sometimes it can take up to 20 years to see a yield pattern in a field. And the more crops you have in rotation, the longer it takes to get these patterns to emerge. If you have continuous corn, you'll see yield patterns sooner than if you have like a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. Organic matter is another factor people use to make maps, elevation, soil series, or a combination of any of these factors. So just to compare 2 methods, one of our fields in Central Ohio, we call it Central Ohio number 2, they use soil series to create their zones. This is a picture of their field here. Again, the grayscale is their zones based on soil series. The circles are where we pulled soil samples, so we had a half-acre grid in our strips where we pulled soil samples, measured all of the soil properties, including texture there, and compared their zoning method to how the fields are similar based on our grid soil sampling. And so looking at soil series, there was a pretty high error rate. We calculated at 40%. So web soil survey and soil maps are not meant to make zones. That's not what they were created for. So it can be used to make zones, but probably isn't the best way to divide up a field. Yeah.
So what we're seeing there is soil map units as opposed to soil series.
Yep, soil map units.
Map unit comprises of 2 or 3 different soil series.
Yep. So Shaki down here, he's a collaborator in the project, so it's good to have someone that knows more than me. I always try to surround myself with people who are smarter than me, so thank you, Shaki. Yep. Yeah, so it's not very accurate, this particular method. The second field we called West Central Field number 2. I don't have a picture of that one, but they base their zones and their prescription on multiple factors. And I don't know what all of those are necessarily, but their error rate was a lot less. So basically dividing the field based on soil properties, using grid soil samples was a more accurate way to make zones within the field. So the prescriptions based off of high resolution grid soil sampling did create more homogeneous zones, so zones that are more similar compared to web soil survey or something like that. The advantage of this grid soil sampling as well is the usefulness in using it for variable rate lime or fertilizer. So with these soil samples, we see a lot of variability across the field. Again, this is going back to Central Ohio too. This just shows pH of the field going across the field. So the white dots had a pH of, those points had a pH of 5 to 5.4. On the other side of the field, pH was as high as 7.1 to 7.8. So there's a really big range in pH in this field, and that's not unique to this field. A lot of the fields we collected samples that had a wide range of pH, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you compare your grid soil samplings and use those for variable rate seeding. They can also be really useful for variable application of lime or fertilizer. So our return on investment is very rudimentary. So, but basically, this is just for one field. We're crunching the data from other fields, but this is Central Ohio 1 location. So what you're looking at here is our partial return. We're using $10.25 per bushel. I have a lot more optimistic prices than the entomologist from Purdue, and our seed costs here. So looking at from a partial return standpoint, the most profitable system was the variable rate seeding in this one field this 1 year. It had about $20 over our next highest treatment, which was 180,000 seeds per acre. So, and that was significantly different. 180 sounds really high. Does that sound really high to you guys? Anyone want to guess what the emergence was in Central Ohio for an early May, late April planted field in 2017? Yeah, it was about 55%. So that 180 is a very high seeding rate, but what actually came up and was there in the fall is much lower. Yeah. This was all treated seed, so this was their farmer's field, commercially available varieties, treated seed. Yeah.
What was your average seeding rate for your variable rate?
That's in a next slide, but it's about 147 was about average for the field. Yep. Yeah, so 180 is not something that's pretty high. That's not something I would normally recommend. But in 2017, with the amount of rain we had after planting, 180 was a good rate to have last year. Usually you can get away with a much lower rate. Last year in Central Ohio wasn't that year. Yeah, and again, that final stand was about 100,000 seeds per acre, which is that threshold we're looking at as a final stand. So other ways to make the zones. So once we can calculate the economic return and compare our fixed rates to our variable rate seeding. And this variable rate seeding was farmer selected. We wanted to retrospectively look and see, is there a better way to make the zones? And it's really easy for me to tell you what to do after the fact. So if I do a nitrogen strip trial in a field, I can tell you exactly in the fall how much nitrogen you should apply. And I can tell you here what seeding rate you should have as well. But it's really easy to look at that retrospectively. So this is what we see on this one location, this 1 year. It'll be interesting to see if the trends hold true. But we also evaluated what's the best way to make a map. Is it elevation, slope, pH, potassium, phosphorus, cation exchange capacity, organic matter, calcium, magnesium. We haven't looked at yield history, but if we can get that data, we'll look at that as well. But again, it's after the fact, what could have been better. And the two layers that rose to the surface in this particular situation was soil pH and elevation. So here we're looking at the ideal seeding rate for yield. This is to maximize yield, not economic return. That'll be a separate analysis, but we'll do that as well. Our field average seeding rate was 146,000 seeds per acre. The first data layer that kind of rose to the surface was soil pH. So when we had a soil pH of less than 6.3, we estimate the ideal seeding rate to be 113,000 seeds per acre. And that seems reasonable. And that was 36% of the field. So 36% of the field would be that prescription. If we had a pH of over 6.3 and then an elevation of less than 293 meters above sea level, the ideal seeding rate was 142,000 seeds per acre, and that covered 42% of the field. Looking farthest then to the right, if we had a pH of over 6.3 and a higher elevation over 293 meters above sea level, we estimate our average our optimal seeding rate to be 212 seeds per acre. And this is a little bit of a stretch because if you remember our fixed rates, our highest fixed rate was 180,000 seeds per acre. So we are extrapolating beyond our data set here. So 212 may not be exactly right, but we do know that it's over 180,000 seeds per acre. Again, this field had very low emergence, but that was 21% of our field would have fell into that category. But what I think is interesting, if you look at the two zones where 113,000 was optimal and 142 was optimal, that's 78% of the field in total. So that's pretty good. So if you're planting 140 to 150,000 seeds per acre, you're capturing the majority of that field, but there are areas that would have benefited from a higher rate in this situation. Does that make sense, or does anyone have any questions about that?
Why is that? Why is, on a higher elevation, we need more seed?
That's a great question. So the question is, why is the higher elevation we need more seed? And we don't have, I don't think, all the answers for that. But Sean Conley this morning was talking about seeding rate, and on droughtier soils, soils that dry out, you need higher seeding rates. So maybe with this higher elevation, those are a little bit drier soils where those higher populations would be warranted. But again, this is one field, one location. We'll need to look at trends over time and space. So the other thing I think that's really interesting about this is the range of rates. Is anyone surprised by the range of rates? Harold's thinking, maybe I'll give him a minute. His wheels turn kind of slow later in the day. Yes. Yeah, I was kind of surprised. This is a 100,000 seed per acre swing. So a lot of the farmers I talk to, when they're doing variable rate soybeans, they vary in a very narrow range, maybe 150 to 165. I see someone shaking their head, so it's good to have confirmation later in the day, so I appreciate that. But when farmers vary, they don't vary very much. And I think that's probably okay because we don't really know how to do this yet. If you only vary slightly, you're minimizing risk. If you're varying 113 to 212, you better make sure you have your 113 in the right spot and your 212 in the right spot, because that could be not a good situation if you weren't confident in that. So, but I think if we can have wider ranges and be confident that our ranges are in the right place, there's a good chance of economic return. This is where you're going to get it.
And so while we're here,
Go ahead.
I asked it earlier, so we had supposedly 113,000, so how many was our population?
About half. Probably about 70 to 80,000. And we can have very low populations and get, yield is reduced, but we can have very low populations and it's not reduced as much as what you think it would be. Yep. We do have yield results. I don't have them on a slide. So this particular field was one of our highest yielding, despite the fact we had 55% of the plants actually emerge. This was in the mid to high 60s. Oh, what the yield differences were there? I don't have that data. We do have that data. I don't have it on a slide. So this is hot off the press from about 2 days ago. But yeah, that's a great question. It would be interesting to see what the yields were. These are the points where yield was maximized, but I don't have the exact yields. Field average was 65-ish, maybe slightly higher. Any other questions or comments? So again, keep in mind this is preliminary data, 1 year, 1 location. We need to analyze the rest of the locations. Usually I don't talk about data so early on. I like to think about it a little bit more. But we'll continue this and look for trends. In 2018, the project is expanding into Michigan. So the agronomist Manny Singh at Michigan State University is going to have, he's going to have 5 corn and 5 soybean variable rate trials. I told him not to do it. So invite him next year, Harold, and see see if he looks like a crazy man. But it's a lot. But we will have data for Ohio and then also moving into Michigan as well this year. So I didn't have a whole lot of slides, but this is a great project. The graduate students, Emma and Will, work really hard, so hard. That's what happens when you get your phone run over by a combine. Her dad told her to put it in rice. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't do that. But the very, very hardworking students, and then extension and ag engineers and Shakti at Central State University, farmer cooperators were really helpful in getting this research done. So, you guys have any comments about things you'd be interested in looking at with this, or feedback? Yeah.
At this point, we're treating this like there's going to be no difference between genetics. Do you have an idea in the back of your mind about how genetics is going to play into this?
Yeah, genetics is a whole nother wrinkle. That's each farm had different genetics. We had some Extend beans, we had some Pioneer beans. Each field had different soybeans. Genetics are always really hard for us to pin down because there's so much turnover. With our performance trials, like Sean mentioned, having a variety 2 years in our trials is fairly rare. There's just so high of turnover. So if we did a trial where we put, genetics head to head, by the time we crunch the data, it would be gone. It would not be available for you guys. So I think genetics can play a role, but we're not looking at that right now. Maybe going forward, but this was just one variety in one field.
In a broader term, not looking at
So yeah, with bean types, and Sean talked about that a little bit earlier today too, and we haven't looked at types specifically. We could with our variety trials and things like that, but when you have soybeans at low populations, they branch, and if you have them at really high populations, they get taller, and there's less branching, and there's probably subtle differences among the varieties. But the ones we look at they all have that capacity to be straight or branchy. So another part of the study, the second student, Will Hammond, he's looking at all the plant architecture. And so with these seeding rates, we have different plant architecture in all of the fields with the different genetics. All of the genetics respond to their environment. Any other questions or comments about this research? Yeah.
I understand I really like how you have the elevation, and I understand that it's hard to find an even pH across those elevations. So why did you choose pH and not organic matter? Because the organic matter would be just as variable as the pH. Right.
So I'll go back to that slide. And that's absolutely true. A lot of these factors are interrelated. They're very related, these soil properties. My graduate student did look at all of them. And the two that her statistics program kind of pulled to the surface were pH and elevation. And Shaki could speak more to that.
Yeah. I think she used what is called random forest from the regression trees. So that algorithm basically looks at the attribute data distribution and pulls out the top two ranking variables. And in this case, it was pH and the other one was pH and
I'm not saying I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah.
It's surprising to see organic matter was left out there. And I think she did this study a few other locations and some other variables also. But it just shows that it's varying from one location to another, which properties dictating variations in variations.
Yeah, there was a paper out of Wisconsin a couple years ago they looked at what factors are important in each field, and they had some factors that were kind of rose to the surface, but they had some comment in the paper that each field is different, which is not very helpful at all to you guys. But each field is different. Yep. We're just trying to see broad trends and, yeah.
The lesson we can learn from this is really when we look at these prescription maps, if they're made using just the soil map units or this organic matter, it might not be, it might work for one location, it might not work for other location. So it's important that we tease out that information and see how we can come up with a prescription map that applies to every field. So that's the challenging task.
Yes, yes. Any other questions or comments about this, or any questions about soybeans in general?
Go back to that map. I think you have pH on it. It's your pH lesson. So the pH, they're random. I mean, I don't see a real pattern. Well, there is a pattern.
Yeah, towards the left side of the screen, the pH is a little bit lower, and maybe towards the right, it's a little bit higher. Yeah, and this isn't the same field, so this is Central Ohio too. The field, the data with this one was Central Ohio 1, so that's not the same field, if that helps. Yeah.
So the layer that's underneath that, Laura, is that like a soil map?
Yeah, this one is soil map unit. Yep.
When you compare those points to the soil map unit, then it appears random. But we have to know that soil map unit itself is, as I mentioned, there are multiple soil samples in it. So we do not have the individual locations of those soil samples in those map units. So there is that random element there, so that we need to piece out.
Yep.
I know this field. And I know it's been grid sampled and half-inch.
I don't think Harold knows this field, because you don't know this field.
Okay.
Harold thinks he knows this field. Harold doesn't know.
So has it been grid sampled in past years in half-acre grids?
No.
That I don't know.
Okay. Harold doesn't know. Any questions about soybeans in general? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, do soybeans respond to banded fertilizer like corn does? And so we had a 2-year study where we looked at starter fertilizer. We looked at it in a 2x2 band. We just looked at nitrogen and phosphorus and different combinations there. We had no response to banded nitrogen or phosphorus or both of them together. All of our fields, though, had adequate phosphorus, so nothing was below the critical level. Everything was in either that maintenance or drawdown range, so phosphorus wasn't limited. Nitrogen, there was no response either. We've done some nitrogen work as well separately from starter fertilizer, and very rarely do we see a yield response to nitrogen fertilizer on soybeans. And even more rare is an economic response. So if you have starter fertilizer and you want to put it on soybeans, if you're low in P or K, there probably would be a response there. If you're adequate, we haven't seen that response in soybeans. And the other thing too, I guess, if you're putting on starter fertilizer, usually you have 30-inch rows, and I think that would probably be more detrimental than having the fertilizer if you have adequate P and K.
So then what are your thoughts on the 6 red below from Illinois? He has that 6 soybean test or whatever. What are your thoughts on all that? It seems quite different from some of the things we've heard in the past.
Yeah.
Fred Belo's 6 secrets of the high-end.
Yeah, and I don't remember them all exactly. I know P and K is a big part of that, and I've seen some popular press articles coming from him saying if you have adequate P and K, still put more on because there's a yield benefit. I'm not going to comment on his work. I can just say what we've done in Ohio. We have looked a lot at fertilizer response in soybeans. Steve Coleman's done a wonderful job doing strip trials, looking at additional P and K. We've done some of that work for him in soybeans, and we don't see a response to additional P and K if we have soil above the critical level. So if our P and K is where it needs to be, we put on more fertilizer, we don't usually see a response. Sometimes you can because things happen, but normally we don't see a response. And we've done strip trials or small plot research. We've also done soil sampling across the state, where we took soil samples from 199 fields over 3 years. We compare yields of fields below the critical level for P and K to adequate, and there is a difference there. So if we have fields below the critical level, they do yield lower. If we have fields that are in the maintenance range, that adequate range, or high range, drawdown range, we don't see any differences across the state in yield on average. So I think our soil fertility recommendations right now are probably adequate and would hold true. If you have enough P and K, according to the OSU recommendations, more isn't going to help.
I just have a question for you. There's research out there that suggests that soybeans take about 5 pounds of nitrogen to produce, let's say, on average. What would you do to improve nodulation efficiency?
So what would I do to improve nodulation efficiency? pH is huge. So if you want to have good fixation, you need to have pH probably 6.2 to 6.8. So as pH gets lower, fixation is limited. So that would be one of the biggest factors there. You can also inoculation. Usually there's no statistical differences. If we look at soybean seed that's inoculated or not inoculated at our 90% level, so 90% confident there's no difference in inoculated and not inoculated beans. If you look at it at a 70% confidence level, there's usually about a 1 to 2 bushel yield increase with inoculated soybeans in a corn-soybean rotation. So there could be a slight benefit there for a fairly cheap input. But yeah, soybeans take up an incredible amount of nitrogen, but we don't see a yield response from additional nitrogen fertilizer. Yeah.
I'll go one step further.
Sure.
I know that it hasn't shown a response because they say that nitrate in the zone of nodulation is probably one of the reasons why it doesn't help out. But the data would suggest that maybe using anhydrous and putting anhydrous and using the nitrogen below the zone of nodulation might actually help.
We haven't done anything specifically on that. We've looked at slow-release nitrogen, ESN, broadcast, urea broadcast, foliar nitrogen, 2x2 bands. There's a paper that agronomists just published. It's coming out in 2018 that looked at all of our nitrogen rate trials. It was hundreds of trials from Maryland to Nebraska to North Dakota down to, I think, Louisiana or Mississippi. And Ohio was included in that data set. And they looked at all of the nitrogen rate trials across all of these states, and the average yield increase due to nitrogen with a one-time application, and that's averaged across rates, but the average rate was probably 20 or 30 pounds, maybe 50, was 1 bushel per acre across. With a split nitrogen application across all of those states, it was a little bit higher, maybe 2 to 3 bushels on average. There were certain situations where inorganic nitrogen application may be warranted. That tended to be soybeans at really high populations and also under irrigation. Those were the two times where nitrogen may have some benefit. And I have a summary of that paper on my website. So if you go to my website, stepupsoy.osu.edu, there's a tab about nitrogen fertilizers, and there's the summary of all the data across the states there if you guys are interested. stepupsoy.osu.edu.
There's paramount interest in multi-hybrid planters, corn, from the answer you gave me about soybeans in your experiments here, it led me to believe that you don't think that there's much value to a multi-variety planter.
Well, there's other reasons besides plant architecture you may want multi-variety. This is my first attempt venturing into precision agriculture, so this was kind of, seeding rate was easier, I think, than multi-variety. There could be benefit to multi-variety. From a plant architecture standpoint, that may not be it, but maybe in terms of disease package or some other factor, there could be value, but I haven't ventured there. This kind of scares me by itself, so maybe in a couple years we'll do that, but there could be value. All right. Well, I appreciate your time, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or call. So.